Welcome back, Netrunner fans, to part 3 of my core set retrospective, in which I'm looking back at the core set from the perspective of 2015 and the things that we know about the game today. We got a lot to talk about, so let's get right into it. First up, we have Gabriel Santiago, Consummate Professional. This is a really cool design, and I wish this guy would have seen more play than he did. He's been popular on and off, and he's kind of come in and out of focus throughout the history of the game, but in general, he's been massively overshadowed by both Andromeda and nowadays Leela Patel. So far throughout the history of Criminal, there's really only been one type of economy that's proven to be that successful, and that's something I'm going to be talking about throughout the course of the video. The economy I'm talking about is the Desperado data sucker security testing type of thing that's based upon stacking abilities when you make successful runs. Gabe's ability obviously synergizes with this kind of economy. Being able to get 2 more credits on that first successful run on HQ seems really good. Also, the fact that you can use Sneak Door Beta with him to get a lot more value out of an already strong card. These things are all working in favor of Gabe. Unfortunately, Andromeda is just a little too well-rounded, and I think just has overshadowed him overall. At this point in the game, I think we've proven that Andromeda getting those 4 cards up front is a more effective economic bonus than Gabe having this additional source of credits. This is just because Andromeda is able to much more quickly set up the economic engine I'm describing here. She's a lot more rapidly installing Data Sucker and Desperado, and therefore is reaping returns on them more quickly than Gabe. So early in the game, Gabe is trying to locate these cards, clicking to draw, and things like that, whereas Andromeda has likely already set them up and is already seeing returns. So even though Gabe potentially has a deeper well, Andromeda being able to set up and reap returns on the economy engine more quickly has proven more effective than Gabe. The other weakness of Gabe is that his ability isn't very well-rounded. It's pretty obvious how to deal with Gabe. You already need to defend HQ against all criminals because of stuff like Syphon, but this additional thing dogpiling on HQ just makes defending HQ thoroughly more effective, so things like Chrysium Grid on HQ are even better than they would be against somebody like Andromeda or Leela. Gabe would have been better if his ability was weaker, but more versatile. I would have liked to see his ability trigger the first time that you make a successful run on any central server, but only give him 1 credit. This would have allowed him to, early in the game, run archives, and if he was able to find either a Data Sucker or a Desperado, he would be able to basically click for 2 in these early game states. It would just allow him to use his ability a lot better in the early game. As it is, he really has to jump through some hoops to get those 2 credits in the early game. I would have liked to see Andromeda have no link and Gabe have a link, as well as this change to his ID ability. This would have made Gabe a lot more well-rounded and just more robust economically, and it would have given some incentive to maybe play him over like Leela, because he'd still be able to run into like R&D and archives and utilize his ID ability. The real nail in Gabe's coffin is Leela Patel, who just does the early aggression thing a lot better than he does. She can just really explode in the early game because of her ability to utilize R&D as a threat to HQ in the way that she can run into R&D. If she gets in and scores, she can bounce whatever's in front of HQ, and then you're wide open to stuff like Syphon. This is also one of the more effective ways to deal with stuff like Chrysium Grid. Overall, Gabe is good. He's just not as good as some of the other runner options, and while he's able to utilize all of the best economic tools and powerful aggressive options of Criminal, the other IDs can just do that better. So unfortunately, while Gabe has been cool, and I think a lot of people have liked him, he's really just never shined to the point where I think he could have. We're going to be spending a bit of time with this next one, and that's of course Account Syphon. Account Syphon is sort of a reprint from original Netrunner. It's a combination of two cards. Edited shipping manifests is more the economic gain side of Account Syphon, and Weather to Finance Pipe, what a terrible card name, that is more the denial part of Account Syphon. Now in Android Netrunner, we got a card that was really good at both of those aspects. If you played Netrunner around the release, you definitely felt the hurt associated with Account Syphon. This was just an effect that there really wasn't a whole lot of ways to deal with early in Netrunner, and as the Corp, you pretty often found yourself in situations where you really didn't have much of a choice but to get siphoned in the early game. A lot of early players were quick to blame Account Syphon for that, and I don't think Account Syphon's design was totally blameless, but I think a lot of it had to do with surrounding circumstances. The first is something I've talked about extensively in these videos, which is just that the early breaker suites were too robust and they were too easy to import into criminal and other factions. So I see the problems of Syphon as largely being that it's too easy to get into HQ, and it was especially the case early in Netrunner that it was just too easy to overcome the cheap ice that you were able to res in the early game. This was magnified by problems within the corporation card pool, namely that there were too few cheap end-the-run ice early in the game, as well as the fact that there weren't a lot of options in each faction of that type. As we've gotten more and more cheap ice that we can res early in the game, Syphon has just gotten less effective. Also, there have been a lot of tools that have been printed that specifically address Syphon. So stuff like Chrysium Grid and Caprice Nisei have really reduced the power level of a card like Syphon. Another aspect of the card pool with the Corp was that there weren't a lot of ways to punish tags, and I think to this day, tag punishment is a little too weak. Really, the only forms of tag punishment that see much play are blowing up the runner with stuff like Scorched Earth and Traffic Accident, and it's pretty hard to double scorch your opponent when you just got siphoned. It's also worth pointing out that the faction that had the most tag-oriented tools has never been very incentivized to use them because of problems associated with AstroScript. I don't want to go into a lot of detail here, but the basic story is that there's not a lot of reason to play a tag-oriented NBN deck, especially earlier in Netrunner, when you could just abuse chaining AstroScripts. In modern Netrunner, I think it's fair to say that Syphon isn't really much of a problem. That isn't to say that I particularly like the card. The biggest thing that I don't like about Syphon is that there's a huge learning curve for new players to getting around losing to it all the time, and it can be extremely frustrating to just lose to Syphon over and over when you haven't played a bunch of games against it. Early Netrunner players were not immune to this learning curve, and a big reason why Syphon has become less good over time is that we've figured out patterns of play to deal with it. Here's a shameless plug for my video that explains some of these patterns. When it gets down to it, most of the problems with Syphon were associated with both players learning how to play and also the surrounding card pool. I don't really think Syphon was the core problem. If we could do it all again, I would rather see fixing things like the Anarch Breaker Suite than nerfing something like Syphon, though it might be a good idea to nerf Syphon a little bit for this frustration issue I was talking about. I think a lot of new players really do get discouraged by this card because when you're just learning how to play, it feels so impossible to deal with the fact that you get buried under 2 or 3 siphons in the early game, you can't res anything, and all you can do is click for credits. That said, I would never advocate something like the total removal of an effect like Syphon from the card pool. There needs to be a way to deny the corporation credits, and I think largely Syphon serves that role well. I would have just liked to see the economic upside of Syphon being weaker. An easy way to do that would have been giving you more tags, or potentially further limiting the number of credits that you could gain from stealing from the corporation. Overall, I think the issues with Syphon have been massively exaggerated, or at least they've been misfocused. I don't think Syphon was exactly the best design, but I think that it's largely better than people give it credit for, and most of the problems that people associate with it are actually problems that are greater in the card pool, less obvious and more complex, like the Anarch Breaker suite and some of the things I was talking about with tag punishment. The next card that we have is Easy Mark. This card really just never saw that much play, though it did see a little bit of play, especially in Andromeda, who wants to drop 4 cards on the first turn, and this is just a cheap and easy way to do that. This is a perfect example of a subtype that wasn't utilized. Easy Mark is a job subtype, and I would imagine that most people listening to this didn't know that. I would have liked to see a combination of infiltration and this card, and I'll talk about this again when we talk about the neutral cards. I would have liked to see infiltration either expose or gain 3, and have been a criminal card that costs 1 influence, and Easy Mark instead have been a neutral card that costs no influence. Then we maybe could have done more interesting things with the job subtype. It could have just been a more widely played card, and infiltration would have been a little more playable as well, because like I've talked about with expose effects, they're just really not that good. The next card is Forged Activation Orders. This was a direct reprint from the original game, actually including the name and everything. And this is a perfect example of a card that now exists as a metagame specific option. Early in Netrunner, we played this card pretty extensively, but that largely had to do with the lack of some of the modern economic options that we have. Both Easy Mark and this have largely been pushed out of decks as more and more economic tools become available for Criminal. So this is the type of card that's usually like card 46 and 47 of your Criminal list. You want to play it, but there's a lot of incentive to play other cards instead of it. So unless you're doing a lot of like de-resing ice or destroying ice like that, this card really just isn't that great. This card was pretty good. I think it had a lot of good ideas. I like that it exists in the game, and I don't think there's a whole lot I would change about it. It fills a nice metagame-specific role. It's a lot more powerful when the metagame is rife with expensive ice. So this card's just a decent design all around, and I don't think there's much I would change about it. Next up is Inside Job. This is a perfect card that works because it costs a lot of influence, and it's a type of effect that only exists in one faction. This is certainly a frustrating card to play against, especially with certain corporation decks, because it just so fundamentally breaks the rules of the way that ice works. Early in Netrunner, this card was a bit lame, just because of how easy it was to overcome ice. So this plus one of the Anarch Breakers would almost always get you into any 2 ice server. This is a good candidate for a card that might have been better to keep out of the core set and instead put it in one of the data packs in the Genesis cycle. Early in the game, this just bolstered the incredibly powerful Criminal faction and was a big reason why Criminal was so dominant outside of some of the other stuff we've talked about. I would have liked to see this card maybe pushed to one of those data packs and released a little later on to give the other factions a bit of a head start. But that's such a minor complaint. This card has worked pretty well overall in the history of the game, and I think it's just a core Criminal effect that needs to exist in the game. Next up, we have Special Order. This card has worked out pretty well, and I'm pretty satisfied with this design overall, and this was just a good example of a limited tutor that worked as an event. Now, the main lameness associated with this card is the fact that it pretty much exclusively tutored up the Anarch rig that I've talked about so much in these videos. So really any of the problems with this card were problems with that rig. Increasing the influence of Corroder, Yogg, or Mimic would have been a great way to decrease the tenacity of criminal rigs that use Special Order to find them. As it is, you're pretty easily playing 2 copies of all your breakers, and it's kind of lame that when they trash your critical breaker, you're usually able to recover pretty easily. Seems to me like Criminal should have had that as a weakness. When your program gets trashed, you should have been a lot more hosed than you are. Now, it's still the case that Criminal has the weakest ability to bounce back from that, but that largely has to do with things involving the Shaper card pool, the fact that Clone Chip is cheap on influence and Anarch almost always plays it, and some other maybe issues with cards that I don't want to get into. In general, this card works pretty well, but I think most of the lameness associated with it was the low influence cost of the Anarch rig. I remember reading somewhere that someone suggested putting this card in Anarch instead of Criminal, and that to me seems like a pretty good suggestion. Since Anarch already had the best available rig, this would be a card that would be far weaker in Anarch, and it would be a lot more interesting if Criminal had to spend influence on this card and the breakers, rather than just being able to easily and cheaply import the best breakers in the game and already having access to this card. Next up is Lemuria Code Cracker. This card really just never saw much play. It was occasionally used as an anti-PE tool, but I think in general, expose effects have been largely too weak, and this is a perfect example of that. The main problem that I see with expose effects is that generally exposing the card is the primary effect, whereas that's much more well suited to a secondary effect. If we look at modern day cards that expose like Drive-By, the primary effect of Drive-By is the ability to trash a card for free, and being able to expose the card is definitely secondary. In order for expose effects to really be good enough, they generally need to be something you can do over and over. Now, Lemuria Code Cracker is a pretty good example of an expose effect you can use multiple times. Really only Silhouette is the other way to do that kind of thing. The big problem with Lemuria Code Cracker is not only do you have to already make the HQ run, but you have to spend a click. I think the HQ run thing would have been fine, but this easily could have just cost credits and not a click to use the expose effect. I would have rather seen something like pay 2 credits, expose a card, and basically just have it worded the same way, and just avoid having it cost a click. As it is, spending that click is almost never going to be worth it, especially since you also have to include this card in your deck. You're probably not going to want to play too many copies of it because it's just going to clog up slots, and in general, this card has just never really been good enough, except as a metagame option against some decks like PE. Expose effects can produce some interesting game states. It's usually more interesting when both players have shared information about some aspect of the board, so I would have liked to see expose effects just be a little better across the board. Next up, we have the classic criminal console, that's Desperado. To this day, there isn't a better console than Desperado. There have been a lot of consoles printed since Core Set, and we haven't seen one overpower this, not only as a criminal console, but just in general, this is the best console in the game. Some might argue that that is because Desperado is too strong, but I really just don't agree with that. In general, I think that this card has been a really positive thing for the game. The big thing about Desperado is that you have to make a lot of strategy concessions in order to play it. You have to build your deck around the idea of making lots of runs, and really all of the problems associated with this card are associated with the fact that you can import Data Sucker for 1 influence. Like I said in the Anarch video, I would just prefer that Data Sucker just didn't exist as a card. I would like to see the card just outright removed from the card pool from the modern game, but in the initial card pool of the core set, it would have been a lot better if that card just didn't exist at all. Desperado would have been far less of a problem in early criminal decks if it weren't for the fact that you could play Data Sucker, and a lot of times you were able to have multiple Data Suckers going because it was so easy to play like 2 or 3 Data Suckers in your deck based around Desperado. As it is, with Desperado Data Sucker as the primary sort of economy for criminal, I don't really see a way to build criminal decks that aren't based on successful runs, and that's really unfortunate. I think that's a big reason why Criminal has fallen out of favor lately, is because there just isn't a way to build an economy that isn't based on making tons of runs. So at the same time that I would have liked to see Data Sucker just outright removed, I would have liked to see there be more consoles that weren't run-oriented for Criminal. I really wish there was a way to play a more passive Criminal style. There have been some IDs like Ian that have sort of encouraged that, but I don't think the rest of the card pool has really ever supported it. The lack of flexibility in Criminal economy tools is a big reason why they've fallen out of favor lately. Desperado is just a mainstay of that Criminal economy. I wouldn't want to change this card because it's so central to the way that the successful run economy is built. Banning Data Sucker is something I'm in favor of, but at the same time, I'd like to see more tools that are more general use in terms of economy options for Criminal. Also, more IDs that have economy options tied into them would make Criminal a lot more flexible. In general, Criminal has the fewest ways to gain credits or save credits or somehow reduce the amount of credits they have to pay for things from just their ID. And the ones that we do have that actually see a little bit of fringe play are all based on the same Desperado engine, like Ken. Next up, we're going to talk about some of the Criminal breakers that were in the core set. And I just want to make a general statement that for the most part, these are all bad. But the main reason they're so bad is that it was so easy to import the Anarch rig. I don't want to talk about that anymore because I feel like that's basically the only thing I've been saying in these runner videos, but that's a huge reason why stuff like Aurora just never saw any play. With the bar set so impossibly high with the thing like Corroder, there was really just never any reason to play Aurora. And honestly, I don't think I've ever seen this card in play in a real life game. I would have liked to see this card cost far less to install, maybe have more native strength. I think it's okay that you have to pay 2 per subroutine as a massive disadvantage, but man, there's just really not any incentive to do that with Corroder being so cheap, both in terms of install and influence. I want most of the Syphon haters to think about how much weaker Syphon would have been if you had to use this card to overcome barriers. In general, I think there should have been more incentive and more kind of forced effort to make you play bad breakers like this one. In general, the power level of breakers is just too high, and that almost exclusively has to do with the initial Anarch set of breakers. Like I said in the Anarch video, one of the principles of the rig should be that you should have to spend basically all of your influence to get a premium rig. So if you want to play like Corroder as your barrier breaker and play like Mimic and Yogg, you should have had to spend basically all of your influence to be able to import all of those cards. That would have incentivized us a lot more to play more suboptimal breakers, and at least then if we spent all of our influence on the best rig, we would lose access to stuff like R&D interface. As it is, Aurora sucks, and I don't exactly have a lot more insight on the card than that. Next up is Femme Fatale. This is a pretty great example of what a good, expensive icebreaker within Criminal should look like. It's a reasonably efficient sentry breaker, especially since most sentries have pretty low strength. But then it also has this bypass effect that's really, really powerful and is easily worth the 9 install cost. I really like the design of this card. The only thing I would have changed is something that I would have changed basically across the board with icebreakers is just pumping up the influence cost. This easily could have cost like 2 or 3 influence, and we would still spend that in Shaper today because the ability to test run for this, or in some cases SMC for this, is just unparalleled by any other icebreaker in the game. I think we would have easily spent 2 or 3 influence on this just to be able to bypass toll booth and stuff. Plus, that would have made the effect a little more exclusive to criminals. I think it's kind of lame that this card sees the most play in Shaper. Next up is Ninja. Both Data Sucker and Mimic cost too few influence. Then Fairy was printed, and sadly there was never a reason to play this card again. Next up is Sneak Door Beta. This is easily one of my favorite designs in the entire Criminal card pool. In general, 2 MU programs that have a lot of influence cost and also have some really powerful click ability have worked out really well for the game. Think about some of the other options we have like this. Magnum Opus, Keyhole, all of these cards have had a really positive impact on the game. Sneak Door is no exception. This breaks a lot of rules of how getting into HQ works, and I like this way better than something like Inside Job. It's also really cool with a card like this how Criminal can so easily include multiple copies of it and then reasonably have access to it early in the game. Whereas like a deck like Shaper or Anarch is going to probably only be able to play like one of it, and it's going to have to use some sort of tutor effect to get it. This is a direct reprint from the original game, but the fact that there were factions I think has made this card a lot more interesting. Not to mention the artwork and name of the card is way better in Android Netrunner. Next up is Bank Job. This is a really sweet economy option that's very uniquely Criminal, and the fact that it costs a couple influence makes it really hard to play outside of Criminal. Having a huge burst economy effect that you have to jump through a bit of hoops and the Corp has the ability to play around is a perfect example of the type of economy option that Criminal should have. I'm a huge fan of this design. This is pretty much exactly what Criminal economy options should be. It's limited, but extremely powerful, and a smart Corp has a way to mitigate it. To this day, I wish there were more options like this that were really powerful economic cards that you had to jump through a fair number of hoops to get to work. Next up is Crash Space. This is a great design, but unfortunately it's been massively overshadowed by Plascrete Carapace. I really like the idea of resources that avoid meat damage, because most of the meat damage effects only work if you're tagged. I think that's a pretty cool tension where it's possible for them to trash the resource if they get a turn where you're tagged. I really like that. I would have liked to see this compete a bit more with Plascrete though. I think it could have just been better. I would have liked to see some combination of decoy in this. Maybe something like where you could trash it to prevent the meat damage, or you could pay 2 and trash it to avoid a tag, or something like that. Just some way to make this a little more competitive with Plascrete. Next up is Data Dealer. This is a pretty interesting card, but one that's just really never seen a ton of play. I'm not sure why this needed to be in the core set. That said, I think that there's definitely a future for this card. I don't think we've seen the end of effects that go into the score area as agendas. As the game adds more things like this card's going to be increasingly realistic as an option. One thing I would say with this is it probably didn't need to cost a click to activate. Seems to me like forfeiting an agenda, or even like a Shiku that's like taking the place of an agenda, is still not really worth a click. It would have been okay for this to just like say forfeit an agenda, gain 9. That would have been fine. I also think this card could have just not been in the core set and could have instead been in one of the early data packs. This is kind of an effect that sat in your box for a long time. There's always been some kind of janky things to do with it. It's an interesting card, but I'm not sure it's worthy of like core set sustainability. The last Criminal card is Decoy. This has been a reasonably interesting card. It's had some marginal use, especially with Hostage to tutor it up. I don't think it's a terrible design. I think it's nice to have the ability to avoid tags like this, but in general this has been overshadowed by better ways to deal with the Scorched Earth thing, especially Plascrete. This is a cool design, it's interesting, I just think this could have been better. And like I said with Crash Space, it would have been cool if this was just combined with Crash Space to make both this and Crash Space a little more competitive. One thing I'll say about this card is that the goofy flavor and artwork of it is definitely something that's defined Android Netrunner for me. I like how light-hearted the dystopian future of the game is, and this is just a perfect example of like goofy artwork and goofy flavor text. That's going to do it for my core set criminal review. In general, I've really liked the way that core set criminal has impacted the game. It had a really decent card pool, and I think most of the cards were really well designed and not very problematic. Criminal card pool today looks pretty similar to criminal card pool from core set, and a lot of the decks are still playing a lot of the same cards. I think that's a mark of really good cards in the card pool to begin with. And like I said at the beginning of these reviews, one of the things that I think that the designers absolutely got right was putting a lot of the best cards in each faction in the core set. I really like that for new players. They get to buy this one box that has a lot of the best cards for their favorite faction, and I think Criminal did that better than any of the other runner side factions. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, please click subscribe and the button that looks like a thumbs up, and I'll see you pretty soon for some more of these core set reviews.